In October 1942, the Pacific Ocean was littered with wreckage and oil slicks, the battered remains of another brutal clash between American and Japanese forces. Among the drifting debris, one ship, scarred and broken, made her way slowly toward the friendly harbor at Noumea. She was the USS Enterprise, CV-6, the only remaining operational American aircraft carrier in the Pacific. The once proud flagship of the U.S. Navy now resembled a wounded giant, limping home through waters that still echoed with the thunder of battle. The Battle of Santa Cruz had been fought with unrelenting fury. Waves of Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes had descended from the clouds like a storm of fire, targeting the Enterprise with precision. Explosions ripped through her decks, and thick black smoke curled into the tropical sky. Bombs cratered her flight deck, tearing through steel as if it were paper. One blast jammed the number 2 elevator in a twisted heap of metal, trapping aircraft below. Fuel lines were ruptured, aviation gasoline flooded compartments, and flames licked the bulkheads. For a moment, it seemed the carrier's fate was sealed, yet she did not die. The ship that sailors had nicknamed the Biggie had already survived more battles than most in the Pacific Fleet, from the attack on Pearl Harbor to the Doolittle Raid, the Battle of Midway, and the Eastern Solomons. Enterprise had been everywhere the fighting was fiercest. Each time she returned, she carried new scars, but she always came back to fight again. At Santa Cruz, the damage was devastating. She was hit by at least 2 bombs and a near miss that shook the entire ship from bow to stern. Still, under the steady command of Captain Osborne B. Hardison and the courageous efforts of her crew, Enterprise refused to sink. As the wounded carrier limped toward Noumea, her deck still smelled of burnt aviation fuel and cordite. Men worked in shifts around the clock, patching holes, clearing debris, and tending to the wounded. Below decks, engineers and damage control teams fought constant flooding, bracing bulkheads and sealing leaks as seawater poured in. Every man aboard knew what was at stake. With her sister carriers Hornet and Wasp already sunk, the loss of Enterprise would leave the Pacific without a single operational fleet carrier. The balance of the war hung on a ship barely held together by steel plates and stubborn willpower. There was an unspoken truth among the crew. If Enterprise went down, the United States Navy would lose its only shield between Japan and the vulnerable lines of supply to Guadalcanal. The Marines fighting in the jungles there depended on her aircraft for air cover. Without that, the entire island campaign could collapse. The carrier was not just a ship, she was the heart of the Pacific defense. Every rivet, every pump, and every sailor's heartbeat mattered. At night, the horizon was dark except for the faint glow of welding torches. Sparks fell like orange rain as damage control teams worked tirelessly to repair her hull. The men were exhausted, many of them wounded or burned, but no one stopped. Their uniforms were blackened with soot, their faces lined with fatigue, yet their determination was unbreakable. One sailor would later recall, "We were held together by patches, prayers, and pure grit." The air was thick with the sound of clanging metal and the hiss of steam. Pumps groaned as they struggled to keep the lower compartments dry. Above deck, the flight crews prepared what few aircraft remained flyable. Mechanics scavenged parts from wrecked planes to keep others in the air. The ship's radar, though partially damaged, still scanned the skies. Every blip, every echo could mean another attack. Enterprise's engineers faced an impossible task. Her elevator jammed in place, her flight deck pocked with craters large enough to swallow a truck, and her communications partially severed. Yet orders from Admiral William Bull Halsey were clear: Enterprise must be kept in service. There was no time for lengthy repairs. The war could not wait for perfection, it demanded endurance. The ship's log from those days reads like a chronicle of controlled chaos. The crew cataloged damage with calm precision: bomb penetrations, shattered anti-aircraft guns, ruptured fuel lines. But between the lines, the true story was one of human will. The cooks became welders, clerks became mechanics, and young sailors barely out of high school found themselves sealing holes in the deck with steel plates glowing red hot. As Enterprise neared Noumea, The harbor lights shimmered in the distance like a promise of rest. But the relief was short-lived. The shipyard there was ill-equipped to handle a vessel of her size. There were no dry docks, no heavy cranes capable of lifting her shattered sections. Enterprise would have to be repaired at sea, a desperate improvisation that had never been attempted on such a scale. The officers convened a tense meeting in the wardroom, the smell of oil and salt air thick around them. The situation was dire, yet no one spoke of giving up. Instead, Lieutenant Commander Herschel A. Smith, the ship's damage control officer, quietly proposed a plan. He knew the Enterprise inside and out, every bulkhead, every compartment, every weld. His confidence steadied the room. If any man could save her, it was him. His words were simple but carried the weight of the ship's fate. We can make her fight again. As dawn broke over the harbor, work began anew. Seabees and Navy welders joined forces with the Enterprise crew. Steel plates were cut and welded over the bomb holes, elevators braced, and damaged flight deck sections reinforced with whatever materials could be found. The ship that should have been laid up for months would be patched, sealed, and sent back into combat in days. For the sailors who had endured Santa Cruz, the idea of rest was replaced by a grim sense of purpose. They understood that their struggle was larger than themselves. Each welt, each rivet driven into the carrier's hull was an act of defiance against the rising tide of war. The USS Enterprise would not die quietly. She would sail again, wounded, weary, but unbroken. As word spread throughout the Pacific Fleet that the Enterprise was still afloat, morale soared. The Japanese had reported her sunk multiple times, calling her the ghost ship. Now, the legend grew. She had taken bomb after bomb, torpedo after torpedo, and still she refused to sink. The men aboard began to believe the ship was blessed, or perhaps simply too stubborn to die. In the coming weeks, the Enterprise would return to battle, her decks patched and her heart renewed. The war in the Pacific would continue to rage, but the ship that refused to die would carry the hopes of a nation on her scarred hull. The story of the Enterprise after Santa Cruz was more than a tale of steel and fire. It was the story of human endurance, of men who refused to let defeat take hold. It was the moment when a crippled carrier became a living symbol of resilience, a ship that embodied the American spirit in its purest form. The Pacific War still had many battles ahead, but for now, the USS Enterprise stood as proof that courage could hold a ship together when bolts and beams could not. In the dimly lit bowels of the USS Enterprise, where steam pipes hissed and the hum of machinery filled the air, one man moved with steady purpose. Lieutenant Commander Herschel A. Smith, the ship's damage control officer, was a figure of quiet authority. His uniform was often smeared with oil, his sleeves rolled up, and his voice calm even when chaos reigned. Smith was not a man of theatrics or bravado. He was an engineer, a problem solver, and at this stage of the Pacific War, he was one of the most vital men aboard the most battered carrier still afloat. In late 1942, the United States Navy was stretched thin across the Pacific. Carriers like the Yorktown and Hornet lay at the bottom of the ocean, victims of the brutal contest for naval supremacy. The USS Enterprise stood nearly alone, scarred from the Battle of Santa Cruz and struggling to remain operational. Every pump, bulkhead, and electrical circuit mattered, and it fell to Herschel Smith to make sure they worked. Smith was known among the crew as the man who knew every bolt. It was not just a nickname, it was the truth. He could point to any section of the ship and tell you how it was built, when it was last serviced, and how to fix it under fire. His knowledge came not from manuals, but from years of crawling through the vessel's narrow passageways, studying every line and joint. He had an almost instinctive understanding of how the Enterprise breathed, where the ship flexed under stress, how pressure built in her compartments, and where disaster could strike if even one weld failed. When the first bombs hit during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942, Smith was below decks, coordinating firefighting efforts. Japanese dive bombers screamed down in near-vertical attacks, and within seconds, explosions rocked the ship. Compartments filled with smoke, sprinklers burst into action, and alarms blared across the ship. Amid the confusion, Smith's voice cut through the din, firm and measured. "Seal off Section 3, he ordered. Pump out number for bilge. Get that fire out before it spreads to the aviation fuel line." He never raised his voice, yet every man obeyed. To the crew, Smith was more than an officer, he was a lifeline. He led teams of sailors armed with hoses, wrenches, and sheer determination into smoke-filled compartments where temperatures soared above 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Many of the men who followed him later said it was his composure that kept them alive. Where others saw panic, Smith saw problems to be solved, one valve, one bulkhead at a time. During the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, one of the most dangerous moments came when a bomb blast ruptured a main fuel line, flooding a lower deck with aviation gasoline. Sparks from damaged wiring threatened to ignite the fumes at any moment. Smith arrived with his team, wading through knee-deep fuel, the acrid stench burning their lungs. Working quickly, they sealed the line, pumped out the gas, and vented the fumes. Disaster had been minutes away, but Smith's calm leadership averted it. His success during the Eastern Solomons earned him the respect of Admiral William Halsey himself, who referred to him as the man who keeps the biggie alive. But the true test of Herschel Smith's skill and courage came 2 months later, at the Battle of Santa Cruz. On October 26, 1942, the Enterprise found herself the target of relentless Japanese air attacks. Dive bombers descended in screaming dives, releasing payloads that sent plumes of smoke and debris into the sky. When the first bomb struck near the aft elevator, it tore through multiple decks, killing and injuring dozens. Fires erupted instantly, spreading through compartments filled with fuel vapors and ammunition. Communications were severed, and for a moment, chaos threatened to engulf the ship. Then came the voice of Herschel Smith over the damage control circuit. "All hands to damage stations. Fire teams, move to frame 140. Get the wounded out first, then contain the fire." His tone never wavered. Even as explosions thundered around him, he remained focused on saving the ship. His men followed him through the smoke, their faces blackened by soot, their eyes stinging from heat and fumes. At one point, a fire near the forward hangar deck threatened to ignite bombs still stored on nearby aircraft. Smith crawled under the burning planes, spraying foam and water until the last ember was out. The deck was slick with oil and blood, but his concentration never broke. Later, when asked how he stayed calm under pressure, Smith simply replied, "Because I have to be." As night fell over the smoldering carrier, Smith's teams continued to work. They shored up bulkheads, rerouted power to damaged circuits, and patched gaping holes in the hull with makeshift plates. The ship's pumps strained to keep up with flooding, but Smith's careful coordination prevented catastrophe. By dawn, Enterprise was still afloat, battered but alive. The official after-action report credited the survival of the ship to exceptional damage control under extreme conditions. Those who were there knew exactly who had made that possible. Smith's leadership style was simple but powerful. He demanded precision, not heroics. He taught his men to trust their training, to think before they acted, and to remember that every valve and hatch they handled could mean the difference between life and death for hundreds of shipmates. He drilled them constantly, running mock damage scenarios during lulls between battles. Some sailors grumbled about the endless exercises, but when the real attacks came, those drills saved their lives. When the Enterprise reached Noumea after Santa Cruz, Smith was among the first to step ashore, not to rest, but to organize the repair teams. There were no proper facilities, no dry dock, and few spare parts. What they had were their hands, their wits, and a few crates of welding rods. Smith drew up plans directly on the deck, sketching with chalk where reinforcements would go and how the damaged elevator could be braced. He worked side by side with Seabees, using scrap metal from wrecked ships to patch her hull. His deep understanding of the Enterprise's structure allowed him to perform miracles of improvisation. When the ship's elevator cables were found twisted beyond repair, Smith used spare steel lines from an auxiliary hoist system to replace them. When a bomb crater near the flight deck edge threatened to buckle under aircraft weight, He had the damaged section reinforced with overlapping plates cut by hand. Each solution was born of necessity, each repair a testament to ingenuity under pressure. The men who worked under him rarely saw him sleep. He could be found moving from one repair crew to another, inspecting welds, testing pumps, and checking seals. His attention to detail was legendary. Once, when a junior officer reported that a pump was fixed, Smith knelt down, felt the vibration of the deck with his hand, and shook his head. "It is not fixed," he said quietly. "It is working against a blocked line. Clear it before it burns out." He was right. Moments later, they found the obstruction. By the time the Enterprise was ready to sail again, Herschel Smith had become a living legend among the crew. They respected him not only for his technical genius, but for his humility. He never sought recognition, never boasted about his role. When Admiral Halsey later visited the ship and commended the crew for their repairs, Smith simply stood at the back, nodding in quiet approval. For him, the reward was seeing the carrier ready for battle once more. In an age of grand strategies and famous admirals, Lieutenant Commander Herschel A. Smith represented a different kind of heroism, one built not on glory, but on grit, not on speeches, but on skill. His story remains one of the great, often unsung, chapters in naval history, a man whose steady hands and unshakable will kept the ship that refused to die alive when all odds said she should have perished. Because of men like him, the USS Enterprise sailed again into battle. The Pacific would soon witness one of the most remarkable feats of wartime engineering ever attempted, the repair of a crippled aircraft carrier while still under fire. In early November 1942, the USS Enterprise lay anchored off Noumea, her hull riddled with scars from the Battle of Santa Cruz. The Pacific sun glared down on twisted steel, gaping holes, and the blackened remains of once proud gun mounts. The ship looked more like a scrapyard than a fighting carrier. Yet, despite the devastation, the sound that filled the air was not silence but the constant clatter of hammers, the crackle of welding torches, and the rhythmic pounding of repair crews at work. The ship that had survived Pearl Harbor, Midway, and Santa Cruz was about to achieve something no other carrier in naval history had ever attempted: a complete combat repair, performed not in a dry dock, but at sea under the threat of enemy attack. Noumea, located in New Caledonia, was no bustling naval base. It was a forward anchorage with limited tools and almost no heavy equipment. There were no cranes capable of lifting damaged flight deck sections, no specialized repair shops, and no stockpiles of spare steel plates. The crews had to make do with what they had: scrap metal from sunken ships, scavenged parts from wrecked planes, and sheer human will. The task ahead seemed impossible. But under the leadership of Lieutenant Commander Herschel A. Smith, the Enterprise's damage control officer, and a team of Seabees and shipfitters, the impossible became the plan. The damage was extensive. The number 2 elevator was jammed in place, half sunken into the hangar deck. Several bomb craters pierced the flight deck, one of them large enough for a jeep to drive through. Electrical systems were shorted, power conduits severed, and fuel lines split open. The ship's forward anti-aircraft batteries were twisted out of alignment, and parts of the hangar deck still reeked of burned aviation gasoline. But the Pacific War did not wait for repairs. The Marines on Guadalcanal were fighting desperately to hold Henderson Field against Japanese assaults, and they needed air support. The Enterprise, no matter how battered, was the only carrier close enough to help. The order came from Admiral William Halsey himself: Enterprise must be made ready for action. Use whatever means necessary. The message ignited a frenzy of activity. Seabees, those legendary Navy construction battalions known for their motto "Can Do," came aboard carrying welding gear and portable tools. Their first task was to assess the structural integrity of the flight deck. Using steel plates cut from damaged sections of the hangar bulkhead, they began patching the massive bomb craters. Sparks showered across the deck as welders worked in pairs, sealing the seams with glowing trails of molten metal. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning paint. Below decks, Smith directed his teams with surgical precision. He had memorized the ship's blueprints years earlier, but now he worked from instinct. He knew which compartments could be flooded to counterbalance damaged areas, how to reroute electrical power through auxiliary lines, and which pumps could be cannibalized to keep the bilges clear. The roar of compressors mixed with the echo of hammering as sailors welded, cut, and braced the wounded ship back together. One of the greatest challenges was repairing the jammed elevator. Without it, the Enterprise could not move aircraft between the hangar and the flight deck, a crippling limitation for a carrier. Using an improvised hoist made from cargo winches and reinforced cables, Smith's men lifted sections of the damaged elevator and cut away the twisted steel. Seabees reinforced the area with additional beams, welding continuously, often while standing knee-deep in water and oil. It was dangerous work, the heat was stifling, and small fires broke out frequently as sparks ignited traces of fuel residue. Yet the men refused to stop. "Every plate we weld is one more plane that can fly tomorrow," one sailor wrote in his journal. That sentiment captured the spirit of the entire crew. They were not just repairing steel, they were rebuilding hope. Then, as if fate wished to test their resolve, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft appeared over Noumea. Air raid alarms wailed. The welding torches were doused, and anti-aircraft gunners ran to their stations. The ship was in no condition for combat, yet she bristled with determination. When the threat passed, the welders and repairmen went straight back to work. There was no time to waste. Every hour brought new improvisations. The supply officer raided nearby depots for spare materials, bringing back anything that could be repurposed, even sections of old steel barrels, which were flattened and welded into patch plates. Electricians spliced together wiring with whatever insulation they could find. One team discovered that an entire section of the electrical grid was burned out, so they rerouted power from the auxiliary generators. Smith personally inspected each repair, his hands black with soot and his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. He moved methodically, checking the weld seams, running his hand across the steel to feel for imperfections. By the third day, the Enterprise began to look like a warship again. The bomb craters were sealed, the elevator reinforced, and the flight deck, though scarred, was functional. Smith ordered a test of the pumps and engines. Deep in the engineering spaces, the turbines rumbled to life. The vibration ran through the hull like a heartbeat returning to a body thought dead. The ship's propellers turned slowly, and a cheer erupted from the deck. The Biggie was alive once more. Yet there was no celebration, only determination. The situation at Guadalcanal was desperate. Japanese forces were massing for a final assault to retake the island. If the Marines lost Henderson Field, the Pacific campaign could collapse. The Enterprise, barely repaired, would have to sail back into battle. The crew worked through the night, securing every loose fitting, testing every pump and gun. By the time the order came to weigh anchor, she was ready, not perfect, but ready. On November 11, 1942, just 15 days after the Battle of Santa Cruz, the USS Enterprise set out again. The welds were still cooling, and the paint was barely dry on the patched deck. Some of the repairs were so crude that sailors joked they were held together by chewing gum and prayers, but the ship's spirit was unbreakable. As she left the harbor, a radio message from Admiral Halsey came through. Enterprise, the fightingest ship in the fleet, is on her way back to battle. God bless her. The repairs at sea became the stuff of legend. Historians later described them as one of the most remarkable feats of naval engineering ever accomplished. The fact that a heavily damaged aircraft carrier should be restored to combat readiness without a shipyard, while under constant threat of attack, was unprecedented. It demonstrated not only the ingenuity of American naval logistics, but also the resilience of the men who refused to let their ship die. Herschel Smith's leadership during those days cemented his reputation as one of the unsung heroes of the Pacific War. His coordination of repair efforts turned a crippled vessel into a fighting force once more. He later wrote in a report that the spirit of the crew was equal to any material deficiency. Those words perfectly captured the essence of the Enterprise, a ship powered not only by steam and steel, but by courage. When the Enterprise steamed toward Guadalcanal, her decks gleamed with fresh welds and scars that told stories of survival. She was not flawless, but she was formidable. The sailors looked around with pride at the ship they had rebuilt with their own hands. She was living proof that in war, resilience could be the greatest weapon of all. In just 4 days of relentless work, the crew of the USS Enterprise, guided by Herschel Smith and the Seabees, had achieved what naval experts thought impossible. They had built a warship at sea. And now that ship was heading back into the storm. The next battle would test not only the Enterprise's repairs, but the very spirit of every man aboard. The fate of Guadalcanal, and perhaps the entire Pacific campaign, would depend on whether this patched, scarred carrier could fight once more. In November 1942, the waters around Guadalcanal boiled with the violence of war. The long campaign for that island, a small, jungle-covered patch of land in the Solomon Islands, had become the epicenter of the Pacific conflict. The United States and Japan had clashed there for months, both knowing that whoever controlled Guadalcanal controlled the sea lanes of the South Pacific. The battle was no longer about territory alone, it was about survival. For the weary crew of the USS Enterprise, this was the moment their desperate labor had led to. The ship that had been declared nearly dead only weeks before was steaming back into combat. On November 13th, the Enterprise reached the waters off Guadalcanal. Her patched decks bore the marks of fire and repair, her hull still dented from bomb blasts, but she was alive and ready to fight. Around her, the sea carried the wrecks of ships that had already fallen, both American and Japanese. Smoke drifted on the horizon, and the distant rumble of naval guns echoed across the waves. The carrier joined a battered but determined task force charged with one mission: to stop Japan from landing reinforcements that would overwhelm the U.S. Marines on the island. The Japanese were sending a powerful force of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, escorted by troop transports. The situation was grim. The U.S. Navy had already suffered heavy losses in the preceding nights. The cruisers San Francisco and Atlanta had been hit hard, and many of their crews were dead or wounded. But when the Enterprise's signal lights blinked in the dawn, every man who saw them felt a surge of hope. The Great Ghost, as the Japanese had come to call her, was back from the grave. At sunrise, the flight deck roared to life. Despite her wounds, the Enterprise launched wave after wave of aircraft, dauntless dive bombers, Wildcat fighters, and Avenger torpedo planes. The patched elevator groaned under the strain, but it held firm, the welds done by Herschel Smith's teams proving their worth. Pilots taxied across deck plates still scarred by bomb craters, saluted the flight directors, and roared into the sky. Their mission: to find and destroy the Japanese ships threatening Guadalcanal. From the air, the pilots could see the vast enemy formation approaching. The Imperial Japanese Navy's battleships Hiei and Kirishima, escorted by cruisers and destroyers. The Americans were outnumbered, outgunned, and running low on supplies. But the Enterprise was there, and her airmen struck with precision and fury. Bombs fell in tight patterns, slamming into the decks of Japanese ships. Torpedoes churned the sea with white trails before detonating in massive columns of spray. One Enterprise pilot, Lieutenant Albert Scooter Clark, dove his dauntless straight at the battleship Hiei. Anti-aircraft fire exploded around him, tracer rounds streaking across his canopy. He released his bomb at point-blank range, pulling up just in time to see the massive explosion engulf the ship's superstructure. Flames rose hundreds of feet into the air. Hiei was crippled, the first Japanese battleship to be lost in the war. It was a turning point that signaled Japan's naval dominance was beginning to crumble. Back aboard the Enterprise, the pace never slowed. Damage control crews stood by constantly, ready for the inevitable counterattack. Japanese bombers and torpedo planes soon appeared on the horizon. The alarm bells screamed, and the crew raced to their battle stations. The patch carrier once again found herself the target of relentless assault. Bombs fell close enough to shower the decks with seawater and shrapnel. The anti-aircraft gunners fired furiously, filling the sky with black bursts of flak. Despite the danger, flight operations continued. The deck crew, those same men who had welded, patched, and rebuilt the ship, now worked side by side with pilots launching into battle. Many of them had been awake for over 20 hours, running on adrenaline and determination. Every plane launch meant another chance to keep the Japanese away from Guadalcanal. Every bomb dropped meant another chance to protect the Marines fighting on the island below. As night fell, the Japanese made one last desperate attempt to bombard Henderson Field. Their ships closed in, trading fire with American cruisers and destroyers in a brutal night engagement. The flashes of gunfire lit up the sea like lightning. Through the radio, the Enterprise's crew listened to reports of ships sinking, of men abandoning burning vessels, of chaos and courage mixed together. By morning, the battle had left both sides shattered, but the Japanese had been forced to retreat. On November 15th, the remaining Japanese transports tried to slip through under cover of darkness. Enterprise pilots spotted them at dawn and swooped in. Bombs rained down on the convoy, setting troop ships ablaze. By the time the attack was over, nearly every Japanese transport had been destroyed. Thousands of enemy soldiers who had hoped to reinforce Guadalcanal were lost to the sea. The American victory was complete. When word reached the Marines on the island that the Enterprise had returned and struck the enemy so decisively, cheers erupted across Henderson Field. For months they had fought with dwindling supplies and little air cover, but now they knew that the Navy had not abandoned them. The presence of the Biggie meant that America still stood with them, even against impossible odds. For the Japanese, the shock was immense. They had claimed multiple times in Tokyo radio broadcasts that the USS Enterprise had been sunk. To see her planes overhead again, to be bombed by aircraft launched from the ship they believed destroyed, was demoralizing. They began calling her the ship that would not die, a title she would wear proudly for the rest of the war. In the aftermath of the naval battle of Guadalcanal, the balance of power in the Pacific began to shift. Japan's offensive momentum was broken, and the United States gained the strategic initiative that would carry it across the Pacific in the years to come. The USS Enterprise, still carrying the scars of every battle she had survived, became a symbol of that turning tide, of a nation's refusal to surrender, even when beaten and blooded. When she finally returned to Pearl Harbor for more extensive repairs, sailors from other ships lined the docks to watch her arrive. Her decks were patched, her hull dented, and her paint scorched. Yet to everyone who saw her, she looked magnificent. She had been through everything the Pacific War could throw at her and had emerged victorious. Admiral Halsey sent a message to the crew: "You have turned the tide of the war in the Pacific. The nation owes you its gratitude." The USS Enterprise went on to fight in nearly every major battle of the Pacific theater: the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. By the end of World War II, she had earned 20 battle stars, more than any other American warship. She was the most decorated ship in United States naval history, but her greatest legacy was not in medals or records. It was in the spirit of the men who served aboard her, men like Herschel A. Smith, whose hands guided her through fire and water. Men who welded steel and risked their lives so that others could fight another day. Men who proved that courage, skill, and unity could keep a ship afloat even when her decks were torn open and her engines faltered. The USS Enterprise became more than a carrier. She became a legend, a symbol of resilience and resolve, the embodiment of America's fighting spirit during World War II. When she was finally decommissioned in 1947, veterans from across the Navy came to say farewell. Many wept as they walked her decks one last time, touching the steel that had carried them through the storm. In the words of one sailor, "We were part of something greater than ourselves." She was not just a ship, she was alive, she had a soul, and she never gave up. The story of the USS Enterprise, the ship that refused to die, remains one of the most remarkable chapters in military history, a story of endurance, ingenuity, and the unbreakable will of those who served aboard her.